Welcome back to Focus on Wales, with 17 days to go until the Senedd elections. My name's Kyle Bright.
And I'm Adam Griffiths. How are you doing, Carl?
I'm doing okay. What have you been up to? How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing well, thank you. I've actually finally had a new idea for a short story I'm going to be writing this term. So I'm
Will it be published?
Excited. Maybe.
Oh, surprise. We might have something to promote for Adam at the end of the podcast. Yeah. Well, this week we'll be looking at some of the polling that's come out from the Telegraph for this election, some interesting figures, breaking it down by age to see how younger voters and older voters are choosing their parties for the Senedd election. We'll also be turning to the parties of the Liberal Democrats and Labour this week, looking at their manifestos, as those are the two remaining parties that we got to go through. We'll be looking at what they're offering ahead of the May elections. But first, let's see where the parties are standing, shall we? Let's delve into some of the polling that's come out this week then from the Telegraph, and it's quite a large sample size. I think it's up to 2,000, somewhere in that ballpark. So quite a reliable poll by that regard. These are the top headline figures for you. Plaid Cymru at 28.8%, Reform UK at 24.8%, Labour at 15.9%, the Conservatives at 12.3%, the Greens at 9.2%, the Lib Dems at 5.6%, and any other party or independent at around 3.5%. So based off this poll, Plaid and Reform are sort of within the margin of error for these polls, so not really a clear front runner. But we have also had information from this poll which is a little more interesting, which relates to how voters in the 2024 general election are selecting their parties now. So if we look at that, you saw there was actually a trend of Conservative voters going to Reform, and you were talking a little bit off camera about how that could sort of impact Reform's vote, couldn't it?
It's quite interesting to kind of think about the way in which, obviously we've got the kind of parties, but then on top of that, the kind of voting blocks themselves. So obviously you can kind of think about, voters in terms of who votes Reform, who votes Conservative, but then there's also the people who are just generally right-wing voters, right? Yeah. And what's really interesting is that whilst there's a lot of talk about people coming from kind of disaffected Labour voters kind of going to Reform and people who previously didn't vote going to Reform, there's also the fact that I think it was 32% of people who who did vote Tory in the 2024 general election are now saying, according to this poll, they're going to vote for Reform in the coming Senedd election, which is over double the, I believe, 13% of Labour voters from the 2024 election who are now going to Reform. So I just think it's really interesting to consider the fact that whilst, yes, there is some of that Reform support coming from there, a massive chunk of it is ultimately sapping from the right-wing party that existed before them, which is kind of why we're seeing this sort of Reform rise, yes, but also kind of at the same time this kind of Conservative downfall, which means that it's going to be really, really difficult, like we've talked about before, for Reform to kind of get that coalition.
It's not really converting, it's not converting their sort of voter base. It's not new voters, is it, who are coming from perhaps not choosing a political party. It's Conservative voters who are pretty much in their droves converting into Reform voters for this election. And that's the issue, because you've sort of got those two blocks that we've talked about a lot. You've got that progressive left block of voters who might go to parties like the Greens, Plaid Cymru, even Labour. But then on the right wing, you have the Conservatives and Reform. And I think most of those voters are just sort of going behind Reform now.
Yeah.
And that's an issue, isn't it? Because of the fact that in the Senedd, it's kind of designed so that parties work together in a coalition. So if there's only one party that's being backed on one side of the spectrum, it's an issue because there isn't another party to gain support from. And getting a majority in the Senedd is pretty much... It's
impossible.
It'd be pretty much impossible. So
what's also really interesting is, obviously we'll talk a little bit about kind of some of the age statistics in a minute, but the kind of age profile of a lot of those Reform voters is actually old people as well, which
it's another problem for them, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It's showing that the kind of demographic profile of your Reform voter is basically the same as the demographic profile of a Conservative voter, which is showing that Reform are not actually doing the job that a lot of people kind of might think they are, which is this thing of bringing in new right-wing voters. That's not really happening. They're just converting Conservatives into Reform voters.
Yeah, I do feel that sometimes when we do get statistics like this, the don't knows can be more interesting than the actual vote shares for the parties. So let's talk about that a little bit. So the highest proportion of don't knows actually lied with the youngest age demographic of voters, which is quite intriguing. I wouldn't say it's necessarily surprising when you sort of talk about voter apathy, so people sort of not wanting to sort of be engaged in elections. It's not really an uncommon thing for younger people to not be engaged in elections. But it is interesting to see how a lot more of those don't knows maybe are going to the progressive left, as we've seen before, that a lot of younger people who don't know who to vote for are often choosing the Greens as an option, for example. So what are your takeaways from those don't know voters, I guess, who are in that younger age demographic?
Yeah, it's kind of like you were saying. I think what a lot of those people probably are people who are kind of marginal between Plaid Cymru and the Greens. What I think can often kind of happen when you've got kind of polls that show don't knows is it can look at first glance like these are people who you say, who are you voting for, and they go, I have no idea. But that isn't actually the case for a lot of people, right? There are a lot of people who go, I don't know who I'm voting for. I know I'm either voting for this party or that party.
They're just sort of, they're not cemented on the support of one party, are they? Yeah.
But they're still going to be very definitively within a certain bloc, right? So, you know, like I was saying, the kind of example of a young voter who's maybe voting for the first time in a Senate election and goes, I know I want to vote for either the Greens or Plaid Cymru, but I don't know which one yet. There's absolutely no chance that that voter is going to vote for Reform, right?
Yeah.
But, you know, the kind of data doesn't quite get that across initially. So I do think that's something that's really important to kind of keep in mind when we're thinking about these kind of polls.
So let's turn to another sort of aspect that we've seen from those age-specific polling data, is that older voters, I guess this isn't really unsurprising, over 75s seem to be strongly pushing towards Reform and the Tories. Meanwhile, the sort of younger demographics going for Plaid and the Greens, which is, I suppose this poll is just more evidence to show a trend that we've seen for a while now. But what are the implications of that for these parties?
The first kind of big problem that any party with a really old voter base, like obviously traditionally the Conservatives, but like I was saying, kind of Reform too, is that a lot of their voter base might die.
It's very morbid.
Yeah, but, it is very morbid.
But it is a serious issue.
Yeah, it is. It is true. You know, the Conservatives had this exact problem come the last election, where a lot of the people who'd voted for them weren't alive anymore to vote for them again. And you know, whilst it's not necessarily a problem in the election itself, it's one of those things where it's obviously going to be a problem for Reform come the next election. You have to, as that kind of party, be constantly able to convince new people to vote for your party as opposed to a different party. And that's a real difficulty for those kind of parties because they have to keep up that kind of momentum. Whereas, kind of alternatively, if you've got a really, really young voter base, that can actually be quite a big advantage because a lot of the time, you know, if someone kind of finds themselves cemented into that pattern of voting for Plaid or the Greens when they're young, that pattern's quite likely to continue as they kind of go on in life. And as a result of that, it means that, you know, really, if you're going to have either a bunch of old people voting for you or a bunch of young people voting for you, it's probably better to have a lot of young people voting for you. The only difference, well, at least in the long term, whereas in the short term, the other thing that makes a really big difference, obviously, is turnout. Older people are much more likely to turn out than young people. So what that means is that for Plaid and the Greens, obviously having this kind of really young voter base is great kind of long term, but in terms of this actual election, it can be quite worrying because if the very people who like you are the very same people who aren't so likely to vote, it can actually be it's
a problem in itself.
Quite problematic. And I think it's actually a reason to really keep an eye on turnout in a way that some people haven't quite thought about. We saw obviously with the Caerphilly by-election, a lot of people talked about high turnout being good for Reform. But I think that actually it's really important to keep in mind that whilst, yes, you know, there's the kind of sort of divorced from politics, not that interested in politics voter who might lean towards supporting Reform, and high turnout means those sort of people are turning out. High turnout also means that young people are turning out, or at least it can mean that. And that can be really, really good for Plaid and the Greens as well.
Yeah, I think that those younger turnout sort of figures, I think the whole situation with these stats, especially when you look at younger groups, is I think it's like the surface of a more systemic structural issue in the fact that when you look at Reform and the Tories, I can remember even in an interview that the Welsh Tory leader Darren Millar did over the last week, he was talking about owning your own home as that being something that people will generally aspire to. And when you look at that and the statistics for the younger generations at the moment, they're struggling more to access home ownership. So I think that's another reason that we're seeing support for those parties who would be more likely to, of course, like put those values at the centre of their sort of ideas. That's why their age demographics are skewing older at the moment, aren't they? So we've covered Reform and the Tories together, we've looked at Plaid and the Greens together, which naturally leaves us with the Liberal Democrats and the Labour manifestos. Let's begin with the Lib Dems. So Jane Dodds, the Welsh Lib Dem leader, and up until now, she's been the solitary Lib Dem in the Senate, I think since 2016 actually. She unveiled her party's commitments in an event in the Welsh capital on Tuesday, and these are the priorities that were revealed. So they want to protect the NHS, so that includes investing in social care, supporting unpaid carers, and ending the crisis in our hospitals. They want to help Wales thrive by reforming business rates and helping people get back into work. They want to give every child the best start with quality, free, universal childcare from 9 months, giving every parent real choice. So that's interesting because we've seen some parallels on childcare and other manifestos, but we'll get to that. They also want to clean up our rivers and seas, so protecting public health, wildlife, and our tourism economy. And I've left one point until last because it's one that's been quite contentious in the media over the last week. It's that they want to stop independence, keeping Wales focused on the issues that matter to people's daily lives. So that last point itself, wanting to stop independence, isn't necessarily contentious in itself because, I mean, the Welsh Tories and Reform, they're also unionist parties. But because of Jane Dodds' response to a question during the press conference where they revealed that manifesto, it became a little more controversial. So there was a question over whether her party would work with Plaid Cymru if they refused to ditch their plan for a national commission to look into independence in a situation where the Lib Dems would hold the balance between either a Plaid or Reform First Minister getting into office. So take a listen to this.
Yes, thank you.
Is that red line, Dave Deans, BBC Wales, is that red line so solid that if Green Apuleworth did not ditch his plan for a national commission, that you would allow Dan Thomas to become First Minister?
It's not up to us as the majority party to create a government. It is up to the majority party to go forward and to find partners, if that's what's needed, in a future Welsh government. And we're making it really clear right now, not just to the political parties, but with the Welsh public as well, what our red lines are.
So in that, she doesn't categorically rule out working with Reform, saying that it's not up to the Lib Dems to create a government. But who is really the target voter in mind here that this sort of statement is meant to cater towards? And does this play well optically for the Liberal Democrats? Because she is leaving it open that there is a world where there could be a Reform First Minister and maybe the Lib Dems do work with that First Minister.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if she's so much trying to leave it open that the Lib Dems will go into coalition with Reform, but it definitely kind of comes off as though she's saying that,
definitely not taking a hard stance on it. It's very political speech.
Yeah, willing to by doing nothing allow them to come to power, right? And I suppose the whole thing is a bit strange because I think, obviously the Lib Dems are a minor party, so the election narrative isn't really theirs to control. And yeah, I feel like they're the only party in this election that's really kind of shouting about independence a lot, either for or against, Plaid.
Well, Plaid and the Greens both said that independence isn't really an issue they're putting forward, is it, for this election?
Yeah, exactly. So, and those are the two parties that are pro-independence. So, in order to have kind of an election issue like that, you need to have kind of parties that are actually talking about it and that want it to kind of be an issue. And if Plaid don't want it to be an issue, then it kind of can't be. And it feels like the Lib Dems are trying to make independence an issue here when it just kind of isn't in this election. And I feel like that is kind of the main thing that sticks out to me is who are you kind of trying to target with that? I don't think there are many voters at the moment who, if you were to ask them what's on their mind coming into this election, would say independence. Do you know what I mean? I think it's just not really the way that the wind is blowing in terms of issues this election.
Well, I mean, even when we spoke to voters in Caerphilly last week, the issue that was coming up the most was like cost of living, health service. And the polls also back that up, saying that that is the main issue. Some are even calling it like a cost of living election. I mean, she isn't technically wrong in saying that the majority party needs to sort of, I think what she's trying to get at is that whoever the larger party is who's trying to find support, it's most likely that they will have to concede things, won't they, if they want a smaller party to work with them. It's just a case of, I'm not really sure if the Lib Dems will even have that power, right? Because, I mean, it's all hypotheticals, isn't it? So it could be that, I know that Jane Dodds was even saying that she was hoping her party might even get into the double digits at one point. I think she's since revised that down to around 5 MSs. But I think it's interesting how she's kind of limiting what she can work with here, because she's saying that she won't work with Plaid Cymru if they don't sort of concede on that independence issue. Yeah,
I mean, again, this is something that is normal in kind of proportional representation political culture. You know,
across
parties
Europe.
Have red lines, right? Yeah. I just think that it's just
an interesting red line, isn't it?
Yeah, because the implication is that specific policy, getting rid of this independence commission, you know, we're not even talking here about referendums or anything like that, you know. Having something like that is really, in terms of the pro-independence kind of policy agenda, it's not exactly the most radical thing in the world. So for the Lib Dems to be so kind of diametrically opposed to it, I think is a very strange position to have in an election that, like I was saying, is not really that much about independence. Red lines are understandable, but why so strong on this is the one that I really can't wrap my head around. I was sort of expecting them to maybe take an approach more like the Greens, where in their manifesto they do have some, I mean, some people have called it a wish list, haven't they? If they were to sort of work with, say, a Plaid government in a coalition. But I think it's quite interesting because the Greens, they've sort of brought forward like bold policies, but they haven't necessarily sort of had an ultimatum like that. So it is interesting to see the different approaches to sort of trying to work with a larger party in the Senedd. And I mean, we touched on this a little bit in the last episode, didn't we? The role of the Lib Dems in this election. And I think the reason this is being talked so much about is because I guess it is the closest we've seen so far of the Liberal Democrats trying to carve out a niche for themselves. Because we were saying last episode about how a lot of the parties are kind of stepping on their toes. So one of the issues that the Liberal Democrats like to push forward on is social care, for example. Yeah. Social care is being prioritised in a lot of the manifestos already. And I mean, even in those priorities that I mentioned, childcare is something that's already been mentioned in other party manifestos. So it's sort of a battle, isn't it, for the Liberal Democrats to find a role in this election to sort of distinguish them from the other parties for voters, isn't it? Yeah, and I do think that, again, it's something that kind of comes out of this kind of the pluralisation that this kind of electoral system is allowing for, which is that if you kind of imagine your sort of normal UK political makeup, which Wales doesn't differ from in a massive way, you know, you've got your kind of big left-wing party in Labour and your big kind of right-wing party in the Conservatives, and you've got a variety of kind of smaller parties. And, you know, the Welsh political context, we've already got kind of trying to muscle in here. We've got Plaid Cymru, the Greens, Labour, the Conservatives and Reform. That's already 5 big parties that are all reasonably different from each other in one way or another. Obviously, we've talked about similarities between, for example, Greens and Plaid, and Reform and the Tories. But it's difficult to see a place for the Lib Dems where, especially as Labour kind of moves more towards the right in the way it's kind of perceived in the UK context, that kind of quintessentially progressive, middle class, not too left-wing economically voter, I don't think there's a place for that sort of person in the Lib Dems anymore. That to me feels like your quintessential Labour voter, especially as the kind of Labour demographic becomes more middle class. The kind of room for that kind of liberal, middle-class kind of urban vote, that just isn't there for the Lib Dems anymore. So I think they're really struggling to find a niche in the Welsh political context in particular, because there's not... In England, they've got that kind of semi-rural, suburban, kind of middle-class, semi-affluent, and that just doesn't really exist in Wales so much, except for, ironically, probably a bit in Powys, where obviously the Lib Dems have historically done kind of okay in Wales.
Well, let's turn to Labour now, because we haven't covered their manifesto, and their manifesto did come out a few weeks ago, but we did cover it, but there were some technical problems, and it's been consigned to history and forever to be lost media now. But regardless, let's cover their priorities like the other parties. So they want to tackle the cost of living through cheaper bus fares, lower energy bills, and they want to expand childcare. Like I was saying with the Lib Dems, childcare popping up again. It is an issue that's actually come up a lot this election, hasn't it?
Yeah, implies manifesto as well, and I think there must be something in the Greens manifesto.
I think so. I think they have the same offer as well. But it is interesting to say on that point about the cost of living and cheaper bus fares that they only reduced bus fares for 16 to 21s after a deal with the Liberal Democrats. So an interesting thing to mention how Labour is sort of trying to adopt that as their own win. There are other priorities though. They want jobs for the future with an energy-independent Wales and a new lifelong retraining guarantee. They want £4 billion to build new hospitals, same-day mental health support, and a new focus on women's health. In that, there's also a guarantee to see patients in 48 hours if you have a pressing health need. So that's interesting because they're sort of acknowledging that some doctors' surgeries are still facing bottlenecks. They also want to protect the planet by cleaning up rivers and seas, growing our national forest and cracking down on fly tipping. Again, that's an issue that was in the Lib Dem priorities too. A fairer future, ending homelessness, a pay rise for the lowest paid workers, and raising school standards too. So, like I was saying, there's a lot of similarities there. And I think one thing to take away when we do look at these similarities every time is that these parties sort of agree on the issues that are there. It's just sort of the technicalities about addressing them which can sort of differ sometimes, can't it? Yeah,
it's actually really interesting because in the kind of literature on kind of the sort of sociology of kind of political science, there's a distinction that's made in kind of issues that can become electorally salient, and that is that there's a distinction that's made in the academia between issues where there's a difference between what the parties are actually saying they're going to do. So, for example, maybe one party says they care about immigration, another party has a completely different value set on immigration. But opposed to that are issues where nobody really disagrees on them, and then what becomes important in that election is whether or not voters believe that XYZ party is going to do a good job of that on that issue. So kind of classic examples, things like the economy and healthcare. Nobody thinks that the economy should be bad. Nobody thinks that NHS waiting times should be high, right? So what really becomes important with that kind of issue then is who do voters think is going to actually do the good job of improving the economy? And similarly with things like childcare and rivers and things, no party is going to say they don't think those things are important. But what's important to voters is, well, who do I believe is going to actually be able to fulfil the commitments that are in their manifesto? And that's a particular problem for Welsh Labour, having been in government for so long in Wales. I mean, I think this would be the first Senedd where the Labour Party aren't sort of in majority control. If Plaid or Reform, as the polls are showing, would become the party that is the largest in the Senedd. It's quite interesting though, because this Labour manifesto has sort of been described as cautious, or sort of a manifesto of continuity rather than radical change. So one example is that in the manifesto itself, they're trying to sort of push their successes that they have done over their term in government. So there's a section saying we've done this, and then there'll also be a section in each issue like health, education, where they're saying this is what we will do. I'm not sure whether continuity is what they want to get across, is it? Because it's a dilemma, isn't it? Because do they want to try and portray their record as positive to voters and hope that they will buy that, or do they want to come across as something revolutionarily different? Yeah, and it's one of those things where they are kind of in between a rock and a hard place, because if they attempt to portray themselves as a kind of continuity with what Welsh Labour's been before, the issue that you're immediately going to run into is that, well, what Welsh Labour is doing at the moment and has been doing isn't popular. That's why they're polling badly. So if you portray yourself as continuous with the government before, that's going to be bad for them electorally, I think. But equally, if you portray yourself as something radically different, that opens up two new problems, which is, firstly, why should we believe you're going to do this? Why would you change completely radically? We don't believe you're going to just turn around because you're the same party that you already were. And secondly, even if people do believe that you are going to do those things, or you do think those things are good ideas, obviously you open yourself up to the critique of, well, why haven't you done them already?
Yeah. There's no perfect solution.
There's no perfect solution, especially when, obviously, Eluned Morgan, as Welsh Labour leader, isn't actually that new now. It's been a while since obviously Vaughan Gething was First Minister. So you don't even have the kind of effect of being able to say, oh, I'm a completely new leader, so therefore I'm totally different. And I think they're really going to struggle with the image to kind of portray here.
Arguably, I think Eluned Morgan has been stuck between a rock and a hard place herself.
Yeah.
I think that it's the issue that's sort of been going on with Welsh politics, and I suppose devolved politics more widely for a while, which is that a lot of people will look at this vote and they will perceive it, some of them will perceive it as a vote on like Keir Starmer's leadership. So they'll look at how Keir Starmer might have failed the nation by doing certain things, and they'll vote in the Senedd election against Labour, even though Keir Starmer isn't, of course, the leader of Welsh Labour, is he? And I actually did a little fact-check piece on the Substack, which you can find in the description, about some placards that Reform were using. So I think it was saying something along the lines of, vote Reform, get Starmer out. And it shows how these parties will play on that narrative, or sort of play on people's sort of lack of awareness of these things. So it's a really complex and tough situation for the Labour Party, isn't it? Another section that I'd like to have a look at is titled A New Chapter for Devolution. So this ties into that issue of change, because they claim that they'll continue to call for more devolved powers. And they say they'll make a case for a fair share formula for funding. And I guess this ties into the idea of the benefits of having two governments at each end of the M4, which we always hear. So having a Labour government in the Senedd and then a Labour government in Westminster. But the issue that I feel is here in this section of the manifesto is that they're calling it a new chapter for devolution, but then the way that they're going to sort of create that new chapter is by continually calling for powers that they haven't yet had devolved, have they?
Yeah, and again, this is another big problem that Welsh Labour have, which is that it is popular within Welsh Labour and Welsh Labour's voter base to have more powers devolved. That's not really been very forthcoming. The rhetoric about the special kind of relationship between, two governments at each end of the M4, I don't think is really cutting through very well anymore, because people are starting to realise that they're not getting much out of it. But equally, the kind of that relationship is kind of making, I think, Welsh Labour come off as more muted. I think there's a general impression that Welsh Labour aren't able to kind of properly stand up to UK Labour because they're both Labour. And ultimately, I don't see how anyone wins from that other than Plaid Cymru, because they're able to make the case that they're going to shout louder and kind of generally do a better job. And whilst obviously I think the kind of counter argument to that, which is that how can you expect Plaid to do any better of a job at getting concessions from the UK government than Welsh Labour, I do think that's a fair point. And obviously, assuming that Plaid end up running the government after this election, we'll have to see how well they do.
Yeah.
But I think that at the moment, when Labour have been in power for so long again, the only kind of response to that can be, well, we've tried Labour's strategy and it doesn't work, so we might as well give Plaid a go. And I think that's what a lot of people are thinking. Welsh Labour have tried the nice route, as it were, and Plaid Cymru are going to do the being a nuisance route. And if being nice isn't working, maybe being a nuisance will.
With that in mind, let's turn to some of the analysis by the Institute for Fiscal Studies. So they've been looking at how well costed these manifestos are, whether they're actually viable to implement. So let's start with Welsh Labour then. So the IFS have looked into some of their policies on taxes, right? So Welsh Labour have said they will not raise income tax, but the IFS have rightly highlighted that the UK government could override the Senedd, couldn't they? And they could change rates themselves. And in that case, it would it would sort of be that the Welsh Government would have to act in response and counteract the UK government, which I imagine wouldn't go down between the two groups, would it, in Westminster and in Cardiff Bay. One way for hospital investment that they highlighted as well is through the mutual investment model. So that's for that £4 billion promise that they want to put into hospitals. That means that they would fund upfront costs through private sector borrowing, and then they would pay service charges when in day-to-day operations. So that doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that it would make any difference to the NHS being free at the point of use. It means that the Welsh Government would essentially be paying the funds back themselves. It's good to accelerate hospital delivery, I suppose, but it is sort of more expensive across the long run, isn't it? So I guess there's a dilemma here, isn't there, of how do you fund these massive promises like rebuilding the University Hospital of Wales in Cardiff?
Yeah, because obviously there's going to be interest on those kind of loans that are pretty much being taken out by the Welsh Government. And this is kind of like an age-old, question in kind of governance. It's this idea of, well, sometimes it does make sense to go into debt temporarily in order that you can fund some sort of big project that's ultimately going to pay so much of a return that it is kind of economically sensible to have that debt, even with the extra service charges. Obviously, the dilemma for Welsh Labour with this is whether or not that's going to happen. I can see the argument for it. If we have a better NHS, that in theory is going to mean that we're going to have healthier people, which means a better economy, which means more taxes, which means the ability to then pay off that kind of incurred interest on the debt. But one way or another, even if that is the sensible option, what you can't get around is that it is going to be more expensive in the long term, because ultimately you have to pay back more than you take out in the first place. So it's I suppose risky is the only way I can kind of really characterise it. It's a risky thing to do, because obviously if
budgets get more constrained,
if budgets get tighter,
future,
then it's only going to get more difficult to pay that off than if they'd never taken out the debt in the first place.
Yeah, and I mean, the IFS haven't really given a surprising conclusion for Welsh Labour's budget. They said, despite being in government for 27 years, Welsh Labour is not fully facing up to the difficult fiscal reality facing the next Welsh Government. And if you've watched the other manifesto analysis that we've done, it's pretty much been the case for every single one. So that's not necessarily an issue with Welsh Labour themselves. I think it's more reflective of politics as a whole, just across Wales at the moment. I think we need parties who are sort of better costing their manifestos.
Yes,
but
and I
don't know if that will happen in reality.
And I wonder if the kind of issue is that in a climate where every single party has an uncosted manifesto that isn't necessarily completely realistic, would the kind of PR gain, the good press that would come from being the party that has a fully costed manifesto that's all worked out, is that worth the fact that obviously the result of that is that you probably can't promise as much? The difficulty is that if you're the realistic one in a climate of people who are all being unrealistic, that means that your manifesto is inevitably going to be the one with the most realistic costing and spending, and that means you can't promise the same things that other parties can. I wonder if there's kind of a vicious cycle there where no party can be the one to kind of make the step towards that more realistic manifesto.
Yeah, it's an issue of sort of, do you deceive the voter by sort of over-promising, or do you be realistic and then the realistic promises aren't that attractive?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a bit of an issue, and it doesn't really surprise me, though, that we see voters struggling to trust politicians, though, when you do have these uncosted manifestos. So I've seen the Lib Dem leader, Jane Dodds, but I've also seen the Green leader as well, Anthony Slaughter, saying, we can't cost certain policies because we don't have access to government budgets. And while that is fair, to have a general ballpark idea of how much things are going to cost, that probably would help with people believing more in these manifestos. But I think the sort of underlining sort of conclusion to this is that regardless of what happens, I think people do sort of, most of the time, they're not really going into the detail of the manifestos. They're sort of just taking the headline promises and sort of the ones that come up in headlines. And I don't think they're necessarily going to be looking for whether a manifesto is costed. I think they'll more just be looking to hope that a party will deliver its commitments. So therefore kind of it has to be costed.
Yeah.
But then that's the thing. Will they actually cost it? Doesn't seem like it based off what we've seen with the parties. Right, that just about wraps it up for this week. Returning to the Welsh diaspora, aren't you, next week?
Yes, I'm heading back to Oxford. Yeah.
Podcast will still be continuing in the meantime, though. So do check us out again next week. You can also check out the Focus on Wales Substack, where you can subscribe to the newsletter, which we'll also be sending out every week with extra stuff that we don't talk about or can't fit in the podcast too. If this is your first time watching, though, a little bit about yourself, Adam.
Yeah, I'm Adam Griffiths. I'm a student in history and politics at the University of Oxford, and I have nothing to promote yet.
But you said you've got an idea for a short story.
An idea for a
wasn't it?
short story that may one day be published with some of my other short stories.
I would quite like to get. I would quite like to get you to have a little section on the newsletter, maybe. Maybe we'll include that. Check out the newsletter and see if we've got that on there. Who knows? Could be this week or in the future. Depends if Adam wants to publish it. Yeah, your big debut. A little bit about myself as well. I'm Carl Wright. I'm a student journalist at Cardiff University. I've written for the Nation Cymru website as well as the Will Hayward Newsletter, so you can find my stuff on there. That just about wraps it up, though. We'll see you next Monday. See you soon.
See you soon.
Bye-bye.